Good to go? Well, good morning, bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Merci d'être ici ce matin. Thank you very much for joining us today. Just 3 weeks ago, I stood before you on behalf of the Canadian Travel and Tourism Roundtable to call on the federal government to update its non-science-based travel rules. Since that time, countless other individuals and organizations across Canada have joined the call for the government to implement a common-sense approach to travel and to remove the pre-departure PCR tests for those who are coming into Canada. While the government signaled its willingness to review the current policy, there have been no changes to date, and the issue is becoming critical. The federal government travel rules, which are out of step with our peers from around the world, are negatively affecting Canadian families and businesses from coast to coast to coast. We need to act now. Today, I'm joined by colleagues representing the Canadian and American business communities to call for urgent action from our government. In advance of the upcoming meetings with American and Mexican leadership at the Three Amigos Summit tomorrow, we ask our federal government to announce coordinated and harmonized travel rules to ensure that Canada is not left behind. This request is consistent with the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership that was announced by Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden on February 23rd of this year, when they pledged to, in their words, quote, take a coordinated approach based on science and public health criteria when considering measures to ease Canada-U.S. border restrictions in the future, close quotes. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, businesses understood that immediate and drastic action was needed to protect the health of all Canadians. This included lockdowns, capacity limits, strict border policies, and other measures. Businesses met those calls cooperatively and efficiently. Now, today, Canada is in a very different position than during the first, second, and third waves of the pandemic. Today, we can see glimmerings of light at the end of a very long and a very dark tunnel. Vaccination rates in Canada are among the best in the world, with very low hospitalization numbers and a population that is anxious to return to more normal lives. Everyone understands that getting back to normal will be a long and a challenging journey. It was easier to turn the switch off than it will be to turn it back on. However, we need to create an environment where we set ourselves and our country up for success. And one major roadblock limiting this progress is Canada's irrational, discriminatory, and non-science-based travel rules. As Prime Minister Trudeau travels to Washington for tomorrow's Three Amigos Summit, we ask that he announce that Canada will be joining its North American peers with standardized and reciprocal rules for travel. This should include the immediate removal of the costly pre-departure PCR test for all travel to Canada by people who are fully vaccinated, and the removal of Canada's discriminatory child policy that forces children under 12 to isolate for 2 weeks after travel and forces so many families with children under 12 entirely out of the travel equation. Now, as we learned after 9/11, when we work together and when we manage our borders according to facts, we can deal effectively with the risks, and we can allow our citizens to safely get on with their lives. And now I have the pleasure of turning the podium over to my colleague, former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley, who is the expert on this. He was responsible for the Smart Border Accord and someone who knows perhaps more than anybody else in Canada about how to successfully and safely manage our borders jointly with the United States in times of challenge. Over to you, John, to offer your perspective.
OK, thank you, Perrin. Merci, Perrin, et merci de m'avoir donné l'occasion de participer ce matin avec vous autres. I'm happy to participate and in part reflect on those days following 9/11, when I saw firsthand the importance of a functioning border, and more importantly, the importance of Canada and the United States in particular in those days, but also with Mexico, working together on a common approach to the border. For decades, Canada has built strong bonds south of the border. There's extraordinary and deeply interconnected economic relationships between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and we need to work hard to protect that in a world that's becoming increasingly competitive. And don't forget, as parents referred to, the many, many family relationships that cross the border. The progress of the past several decades is in jeopardy if the policies of the past 2 years continue. Just as Canada's trade rules had to be updated in 2020, so should its policies on COVID. What made sense at the beginning of the pandemic no longer makes total sense today. The US-Canadian border has yet to return to pre-pandemic normal conditions and operation, and recent changes fall short of a new normal to which citizens and businesses can adapt. We need rules that make sense, that are based on science, that are consistent with those of our neighbors. This will facilitate the movement of goods and of people. The fight to contain and overcome COVID-19 continues as it must. But every effort must also be made to ensure Canadian businesses and communities, families, are not disadvantaged compared to their international peers. All this starts with the removal of the complicated, cumbersome, and costly pre-departure PCR test. More concerning is that Canada's travel rules are out of step with the international community, including our American neighbors. Countries including France, Portugal, Germany, and the United Kingdom have recognized that requiring pre-departure and arrival tests for vaccinated travelers is redundant and have exempted fully vaccinated travelers from pre-departure testing requirements. Canada needs to align with its North American partners at least on standardized reciprocal rules for travel. I encourage the leaders to address this issue at tomorrow's trilateral summit in Washington. It's of critical importance to our countries, their economies, and our people. We need to get back to doing what we do best, working to move our countries forward together. Thank you, and now it's my privilege to pass the microphone on to my colleague and my successor at the Business Council of Canada, Goldie Hyde. Goldie?
Thank you so much, John. Great to see you, and good morning, and bonjour for mes amis. So the Business Council of Canada is composed of chief executives and entrepreneurs of Canada's leading enterprises. Our member companies directly and indirectly support more than 6 million jobs across the country and hundreds and thousands of small businesses who are critical to our supply chains. We consider it our primary purpose to stand up for Canada's businesses, the families and communities they serve, and ultimately for Canada. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, businesses understood that immediate and drastic action was needed to protect the health of Canadians. In fact, we led the charge to shut the economy down. Throughout the pandemic, businesses across the country worked in partnership to help manage the crisis cooperatively and efficiently. And we continue to employ public health measures to ensure the safety of our employees, our customers, and communities. Today, we're in a very different position. Canada is one of the most vaccinated countries in the world, and our COVID rules must reflect this reality. And so, we need changes now. Not half measures or updates weeks from now, changes now. It's time to remove the mandatory pre-departure PCR test, which is damaging businesses across Canada and holding back our economic recovery. This one simple measure, in keeping with the Canadian government's own expert advisory panel's recommendations, will go a long way to make cross-border trips and visits more accessible for families, for tourists, and businesses that make our work possible. We have seen a pattern on policy pronouncements. Eventually the change gets made. But often the delay in doing the right thing comes at great costs and great damage to businesses, particularly small and medium enterprises. Time is not our friend, and delays will have long-term consequences for multiple sectors and their global competitiveness. Canada's businesses, particularly those operating in the travel and tourism space, have already been dealing with a seemingly endless decrease in customer base and are losing their market share. From lockdowns to border closures to travel bans and stay-at-home orders, the tourism industry has been one of the hardest hit through this pandemic. You'd think that with all the progress we've made in managing the pandemic, we'd be out of the woods now. But we are far from it. Despite high vaccination rates, our collective return to normal is proving more difficult than it needs to be. And this is largely a result of leftover travel rules from the start of the pandemic, long before mass vaccinations. We need to trust the vaccines and the vaccinations. We are first to acknowledge that there has been significant progress made, and I applaud the federal government for the headway on our borders. But we really need to have the government follow the advice of their own expert panel immediately and remove the PCR requirement. Common sense requires it. Finally, let me just say that I was very pleased earlier this week to see the letter from U.S. Senators Klobuchar, Collins, Schumer, and Crapo to Minister Jolie, asking the Canadian government for parity in border testing requirements. Now, as we speak, on the eve of the Three Amigos Summit, our federal government cannot, on the one hand, be asking for greater collaboration, cooperation, and consistencies on trade issues, while in a different approach on the border itself. It's simply inconsistent. The message I would reiterate to the Canadian government is it is in the best interests of the Canadian economy, Canadian families, and Canadian businesses to remove the PCR requirement now. Thank you. And with that, I will pass it over to Deanna Horton from the Wilson Centre. Deanna?
Merci Goldie et bonjour à tous. Je suis bien contente d'être ici comme représentante de l'Institut du Canada au Centre Wilson à Washington. Tout d'abord, j'aimerais dire aussi que je suis d'accord avec les sentiments de mes collègues. The Wilson Center's Canada Institute is the only public policy forum in the world dedicated to the full spectrum of Canada-US issues. The Canada Institute is a global leader for policymakers, academics, and business leaders to engage in nonpartisan, informed dialogue about the current and future state of the relationship. It's hard to believe that almost a year ago to the day, the Canada Institute launched a task force on public health in the US-Canada border. The task force, including on the Canadian side, the Honourable Jean Charest, a former Premier of Quebec, the Honourable Anne McClellan, former Deputy Minister of Canada, Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, looked at the impact of these unprecedented border restrictions and identified the lessons learned. The task force's report, released last month, noted the lack of plan for a return to normal border operations as a problem. This is still a problem. While we applaud the governments of the United States and Canada for measures that have eased pandemic border restrictions, this is only the beginning. The importance of the Canada-US border cannot be overstated. Supporting the daily exchange of more than $2.5 billion in goods and services. 40,000 people cross the border per day in normal times, business travelers, tourists, visitors, families. The border restrictions were instituted in a good faith effort to protect the public, and as such were accepted and supported by the majority of citizens of both countries. Yet, as we all know, many, many people were acutely affected by these restrictions. We need better coordination among all levels of government on both sides of the border and with the private sector. We need improved coordination of border measures. And for that, we need a true collaborative effort by officials in Ottawa and Washington. We might also give some consideration to the notion that a Canada-US joint border management framework might better prepare us for the next pandemic. In Canada, we have clarity on strategies to optimize testing at Canada's borders. In May 2021, Canada's COVID-19 testing and screening expert advisory panel recommended no pre-departure tests for fully vaccinated travelers. This is consistent with many other countries, as mentioned before, like France, Germany, Switzerland, and beyond. Let's adopt what the experts recommended. Let's align with our international partners. The uncertainty about travel will persist until there is a coordinated, reciprocal approach to border management. The Three Amigos Summit is an opportunity for our North American leaders to tackle these issues and solve this problem. I urge them to do so. Thank you, and I'll now pass it to Rick Tachuk from AmCham Canada.
Good morning. Bonjour. I would like to thank Perrin and the Canadian Travel and Tourism Roundtable for inviting me here today. My name is Rick Tachuk, and I am the National Chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada. AmCham Canada is the voice of cross-border business. We serve as a first and comprehensive point of contact for U.S. and Canadian companies seeking to do business across the border. With increased vaccination rates and reopening plans accelerating across Canada, our members were recently looking forward to the reopening of the Canadian economy and the U.S.-Canada border. The downstream benefits of these developments would have translated into significant economic benefits and hiring in the coming months. But the reality is that we've expedited vaccine rollout while keeping international visitors out of Canada. U.S. businesses that would have described Canada's business environment as positive has decreased by more than half since 2019. Canada and the United States share the world's longest undefended border. The free passage of goods and people between our two nations feed both our economic engines. And for the first time since September of 2001, this reality is now at risk. Many international businesses are finding it just too burdensome to send their teams to Canada. This is making it difficult to resource, to understand hiring needs, and to predict demand. The Canadian government's mandatory pre-departure PCR test to enter the country is forcing international travelers to do business elsewhere, and Canadian and American businesses, who are longtime partners, are being disadvantaged. But there is hope. A majority of U.S. business executives in Canada believe that the Canadian economy will become stronger in the next few months. To that end, Canada must immediately move to standardize its travel rules with the United States to mitigate any unnecessary impacts businesses will face on both sides of the border, which stem from Canada's outdated and non-science-based approach to reopening the economy. So with that, thank you, and I'll pass the program back to Perrin.
Well, thank you very much, colleagues, for your presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, we would be pleased to answer any questions any of you may have.
Perfect. We'll first go to questions here on the floor in Ottawa, and then we'll go over to the operator. Please come up to the mic when you have a question, tell us where you're from, and go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Beatty. Dave Baxter with Global News, and yeah, we have some news that was breaking just as this was going on. Apparently, Canada is looking at modifying the PCR test requirements. Official announcement expected on Friday that we require no PCR test for Canadians or permanent residents coming back after a trip that's 72 hours or less to the States. Anything longer, you still need a PCR test. Sounds like that's going to be the same case for international travelers coming into Canada. They would still need a PCR test as well. Just what do you make of this change that the government is expected to announce now on Friday?
We have heard nothing official from the government as yet, obviously, but anything that reduces the level of requirement here is to the good, so it's a step forward. So what it does is to get rid of one absurdity. For example, the Prime Minister is about to leave with members of cabinet, members of staff, government officials, the press gallery to fly to Washington. He'll be back within 72 hours. Are all of those people who are going to be on the plane going to be taking a PCR test in Canada before they leave for Washington to allow them to be admitted back into Canada? It's an absurdity, and it makes sense to get rid of that element. But it leaves in place another absurdity, and that is that the expert task force, when they looked at it, said the decisions on the border should be based on vaccination status. That's the criterion that the government has used for virtually everything else, including whether or not you can get onto an aircraft. it makes sense to abolish the PCR requirement altogether.
Yeah, just with the change sort of being a half measure between what you're requesting and what seems to be coming down the pipe here, just where do you see that driving future cross-border business in the short term?
Sorry, I just missed the
Oh,
question.
sorry. Where do you see if this is in fact what's going to be happening on Friday, what kind of impact do you anticipate this having on cross-border business in the short term?
If we're looking specifically at the 72-hour rule, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, the 72-hour rule specifically for Canadians, since it sounds like international travelers, so Americans, Mexicans, anyone else, would still need to present a negative PCR test even if they are fully vaccinated.
Yeah, it's useful to be rid of that. What it's doing today is discouraging people from being able to go over for short visits to the United States. It's a step forward to get rid of that. An example, after last time we met, I had an email from a family who said, our son is like hundreds of others. He's on an athletic scholarship in the United States. We want to go down to visit him for a weekend, but we're of modest means. We can't afford to do that and to pay for the PCR test to come back every time. And the father said, our son is going to fly into Buffalo. I'm going to drive across the border to pick him up. I'm going to be there for an hour in the United States, and I'm required to have a PCR test to get back. This is highly punitive to ordinary Canadian families, and it affects Canadian businesses. It discourages business travel, and Rick made that point very well, that we need to have a border that's as fluid as possible for business to be able to operate across the border. So it's a step forward there, but we need to get rid of this test altogether and found what we're doing on the issue of whether or not a person has been fully vaccinated.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Laura Osmond, the Canadian Press. I wanted to ask you about that expert panel recommendation. As you know, that recommendation came out before the Delta variant was very widespread in Canada. And the panel considered the fact that there may be variants that are more transmissible and warned about that in terms of what the border measures should be, and that they can't contemplate necessarily what measures they should put in place if that's the case. And so given that we have a very different sort of epidemiological reality in Canada than in the US, and that there's a highly transmissible variant now, do you still think that Canada should be resting on that recommendation?
I do believe the recommendation is important, and you're right about the timing. The fact is, this is a recommendation that was made some time ago, which also makes the point that this was before Canadians reached the stage of vaccination, of double vaccination that we have at the present time. What we're seeing with the current wave of the pandemic in Canada is that vaccination is what is making the difference. We're not finding for the most part, we're not finding our critical care units being filled up in hospitals and the system being overwhelmed. We're seeing, for example, now in Ontario, the retransmission rate starting to come down in Ontario now. It's just turned the corner on that. It's vaccination that makes the difference. And this has been the point that the government has been trying to make all of this time. We need to get people vaccinated. If we believe that, we should found our strategy on the issue of double vaccination. If we were to find a variant way more virulent than the Delta variant, and it was clear that vaccination wasn't working, then the government would have to look at what other measures to put in place. But based on the situation that we see today and our capacity to manage the pandemic safely, it simply doesn't make sense to maintain this PCR test.
I wanted to ask you as well about children who, of course, are not vaccinated, and you're calling for no isolation period unless they're symptomatic, if I understand you correctly. The highest number of cases in Canada are among children. They are not yet protected against the virus or against transmitting the virus. So what makes you think that children should not be isolated when isolation rules, even within Canada, are stronger for children who are unvaccinated?
Well, except let's take a look at what the requirements are on children within Canada. They can go to a sporting game in a packed arena. They're not kept out of school for 2 weeks after that or prevented from going into childcare. They can go into a shopping center like the one down below us. There's no requirement on them. There's no restriction. Why would we single out crossing a border as the only criterion that we would use to penalize these kids? And what are the requirements we put on them? For 2 weeks, these children are not allowed to go to school. They're not allowed to go to childcare. They're not allowed to go to camp. They are required to keep a log of every contact that they have that's close with other people, and of every place they go within those 2 weeks. And the effect of this is obviously that it is an effective quarantine that it puts on the whole family, because the kids can't go out for those 2 weeks. They're missing school, and the parents have to stay home to look after them. It just doesn't make sense. And again, why single out crossing a border as the criterion for that? Anyone else?
Yep. Good morning. Joël Denis Bellavance from La Presse. I don't know if it's Mr. Hyder or yourself talked about rewarding Canadians. We have a highly adhesion to vaccination, and the way you describe it, you think this measure is quite punitive for Canadians. Is it time to reward Canadians who are fully vaccinated and who want to travel a bit more?
Let me turn to some of my colleagues, Goldie or John, perhaps. Would either of you like to comment?
Yeah, I'll just pick up on what Perrin said about the government's entire strategy has been predicated on the importance of increasing vaccination rates to the highest level possible. We've done it. We have the supply. We have abundant supply of vaccines. Campaigns are underway to get Canadians vaccinated. One of the mechanisms that Canadians are most interested in is what do I get for doing that? And if it is what many Canadians want, the right of mobility, the right of being able to engage in society in Canada and also outside of Canada, we want to encourage vaccine take-up. One of the ways to do that is to say being vaccinated removes this additional burden and a significant cost. You know, we've put a lot of emphasis on businesses, but when you think about it's that business travel that generates the work for those small businesses, the bed and breakfast, the coffee shop, the restaurant, and so forth. And there are still today families who might be considering doing a vacation to the United States to see their property or to go see their family or to just simply take a break. There might be families thinking about planning even for spring break. But the hesitancy that's being driven is, I'm fully vaccinated, but I have this additional cost for a family of 4 or 5 that might be in excess of $800 one way and another $800 coming back. That is punitive for families who've done their part. And that's all we're trying to say is take the vaccine program and make it the anchor. It's sufficient. We're seeing that around the world. Let's follow the best practices that others are.
And as a follow-up, what should we read as the fact that American senators have been pressing also the government to harmonize their policies in terms of at the border?
Yeah, well, I wish they had done the same thing when we opened our border, but having said that, I think it's important that we are seeing a course of senators, in many cases bipartisan support, which is hard to get in the United States these days, saying we need to harmonize our border. We know that the flow of goods and services and trade is so important to our two respective countries. This is just an impediment that's unnecessary at this time. And I think it's an acknowledgement on the part, to some extent, from the South that of all the people we shouldn't be afraid of, it's Canadians, given the high vaccination rates that they have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Joël Denis, I'm wondering whether I can ask either John or Diana to comment on this. John can talk about the importance of collaboration between Canada and the United States in the joint management of our border, because he did that after 9/11 at a time of enormous crisis for our two countries. And Diana can talk about the study that was just recently done that she mentioned by the Wilson Center, which demonstrated that notwithstanding the pledge that was made between the President and the Prime Minister on February 23rd and the roadmap, that they would coordinate border reopening, what the Wilson Center study demonstrated is that the management of the border throughout COVID has been utterly uncoordinated, and perhaps they would like to comment on that.
Thanks, Perrin, on the view from the past, if you like. 9/11 was a stunning event for the United States, and really at the top of our priority list had to be to assure that the United States didn't feel that they were in any way threatened by an exposed underbelly of potential terrorist attacks coming from Canada. As you'll recall, there were news stories at the time that, in fact, the 9/11 terrorists had entered the United States from Canada. Those stories were debunked later, but they persisted as part of the, if you might say, the bipartisan political point of view in the United States. It was crucial for me at the time to establish a very close and direct relationship with Governor Tom Ridge, as he then was of Pennsylvania, who was named to be the president's Homeland Security advisor in the White House. We worked very hard. You'll recall we produced what was called the Smart Border Report to have a common approach to the border to alleviate the concerns that many Americans felt about being open to Canada and to ensure that our trade and commerce continued unimpeded. The border never closed as it did in COVID from a legal point of view, but from a practical point of view, for a period of time, it did in fact close. And the impact on the Canadian economy was immediate and direct, as it was on the U.S. economy in those northern border states. The irony that I see, and if I understand what may be proposed as well, is that, well, it will address some of the concerns of some of those northern border states because it'll allow Canadians to cross-border shop into the United States and return home. It will do nothing to encourage northern-bound tourism coming from the United States. So ironically, we'll be facilitating U.S. businesses, but doing nothing for our own.
Deanna?
Thank you. Building on what John Manley just had to say, and from my own personal experience working in Washington, every border-related regulator and agency in Canada and the U.S. knows their counterparts very well. So the issue of collaboration is, I think, one that, as pointed out in the task force report, there is no such thing as risk-free. The question is risk management. And I think that people are ready to work together to manage risk. The other thing is the necessity of flexibility, the ability to create pilot programs and implement them. These are issues that were identified in the many meetings that the task force had on both sides of the border.
Thank you, Deanna. And Joel Denis, I would just underscore a point that Goldie made as well. We all accept, all of us accept very strongly the position of the government that the single most important measure that Canadians can take to protect themselves and others is to get vaccinated. The mandates that the government has brought in on travel, that if you want to get on a plane or if you want to get on via and take the train to Montreal, you have to be vaccinated. It creates an incentive for people to get vaccinated. This punitive PCR test and the requirements on children create a disincentive. Polls show that there's a hardcore of Canadians who are simply going to refuse to, a small one, who are simply going to refuse to get vaccinated, but there's still a range of Canadians who are open to suasion and to doing it. If they are able to visit family, if they're able to take their kids with them, if they're able to have a vacation, there's an incentive there for them to get vaccinated. But if they are then priced out of the market as a result of the PCR test and having to pay $1,000 to bring their family back, or if the punitive provisions there are for children mean that they can't afford to have the kids lose 2 weeks of school, then we're creating a disincentive for people to get vaccinated, and that makes no sense.
Just as a quick follow-up, should the government appoint a lead minister to coordinate better the border situation? Because you've got many ministers involved in this file. You've got the Foreign Affairs Minister, you've got Public Security, you've got even Immigration and Health Minister. Should there be a lead cabinet minister that would, determine here's the way forward?
Let me put that to our expert who had to deal with this in the past, John Manley.
You know, it's hard to compare times because when I had that role, first I was Foreign Minister and then I was Deputy Prime Minister. And we had no counterpart to the White House Advisor on Homeland Security related to the Secretary for Homeland Security. Now, of course, we have a Minister for Public Security who more or less is the counterpart on Homeland Security. You know, I think ultimately this comes down to being very practical about it. what I learned in government was that when the tone is set at the top, it's amazing how ministers and their departments get in line. So I wouldn't so much say there needs to be a minister in charge. I would say if the Prime Minister says that his priority is to ensure that the border opens and operates in a manner consistent with scientific advice and international norms, then I don't have any doubt that that will happen. So it really falls in the lap of the Prime Minister.
Any other questions?
Okay, and with that, we'll go to the operator. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, please signal by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. If you're using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute button is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. Again, press *1 to ask a question. We'll pause for just a moment to allow everyone an opportunity to signal for questions.
While we're waiting, let me go back to the first question that we were asked with regard to the possibility of the government making a change in the next few days and dropping that 72-hour requirement. The question that the government will have to answer is, how are you safe in the 72nd hour and you become dangerous in the 73rd? What is the logic of this?
Okay, with that, I don't think there are any further questions. We can conclude the press conference. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, colleagues. Thanks for